That's the question I don't see a lot of people asking, is how do I build a business case for this? They're getting hooked because they believe in it, but we've got to transcend religious belief and really start treating CX as a business discipline.
You're listening to the Legal Mastermind Podcast with your hosts, Ryan Klein and Chase Williams, the go-to podcast for learning from the experts in the legal community about effective ways to grow and manage your law firm.
Today on the Legal Mastermind Podcast, we have Ryan Suydam, the co-founder of Client Savvy. Client Savvy helps firms create fierce client loyalty by designing, implementing, and measuring client experiences. He has coached over 300 organizations and over 10,000 professionals on the skills required to be client savvy. So Ryan, tell us your story.
We focused originally on serving design firms, helping them design their client experiences, and have since in the last 16 years grown to work with professional services firms all across the globe, including 23 of the AmLaw 200. And I still have a really good footprint of architects, engineers, contractors, lawyers, some accountants, marketing consultancies. So pretty much anyone who at one point in time was selling their services as time for a billable rate, but is now trying to refocus their business on value creation, value delivery.
Ryan, I love what your website says about when was the last time clients compared the experience they have with your firm to the last time they ordered something from Apple or Amazon.
Right.
I think that's just an amazing question that I guess this whole podcast can be based around.
It's fascinating to me that you can go to any Chick-fil-A anywhere, and regardless of your politics on them, it's still a great example. So I'll stand by it. Most of them are independently owned and operated franchises with minimum wage employees, a good many of whom haven't yet reached their 20th birthday. And yet it doesn't matter what Chick-fil-A you go to, they're crowded, they're busy, and you're going to have a very positive experience almost every time. So my question is, if you can do that for a $7 box of nuggets, why the heck not for a $70,000 or $700,000 or $7 million professional services engagement?
I wasn't always a believer in the experience because I'm like, well, if you're doing a great job, shouldn't that just be enough? But the thing is that people still enter into a relationship with like another consultant or an agency or professional beyond not just what they're providing, but also what it's going to be like, what kind of emotions are they going to even feel? So much more than just what the product is.
I think you bring up a very important point there, and a great place to start is that practice of client experience, though it's finally, after 16 years of pushing uphill, I feel like it's finally starting to get the appropriate level of press and attention in the industry. There's still a lot of confusion around what client experience is. And you bring up that word emotion. And so I want to put my definition on the table, and for better or worse, this is what I go by. I like to define client experience as the emotional reaction a client or potential client has with any interaction with your brand. So that experience begins when someone who's never even heard about you before first discovers you as they're at a cocktail party and someone mentions your firm's name, and all of a sudden they start to have an experience with you and you don't even know it, to the digital and the web experience and social media. And then, of course, going through the buying process and proposals and contracts and negotiating and fees and all those things, to finally getting to actually consume some services with you. And when they get their first invoice and when they get their 10th invoice, and when your work is done and 6 months later they wonder where the heck you are. There's a whole lot that's tied up in that experience. But the experience is very much an emotional experience because it's very personal and individual for each of your potential or existing clients.
What's the first step to starting to create this experience? I know you've got, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, your CX deck that you go by. What's really the best way to approach this? Because, the customer experience for Chick-fil-A didn't happen overnight. How can a law firm get started?
Great question. And it's one of the hardest questions to answer in a general sense, because every law firm's journey is going to be different because they have existing culture, existing process, existing mind share. So the starting point is really responsive to where you are. Broadly, I'll say there's three big categories to be aware of and look at. You can think about designing experiences. So if you haven't sat down to design an experience, pick something simple. One that always raises eyebrows, but I think there's so much gold in there, is design what it feels like to open and receive one of your invoices. It's kind of a nice little microcosm, this little mini part of the journey. How do you make the process of receiving an invoice as painless? Maybe you can't get to delightful, but you can maybe find some ways to make it painless. And the bar is set so low in the industry for that some real opportunity for innovation is there. So some design exercises are good things to go through. There's implementation. It's one thing to design a way to do something, but now you have to scale it and implement it and institutionalize it across an organization. So then you start dealing with governance and accountability and leadership, and there's a lot to unpack there. And of course, you have to have measurement in place. If it's not measured, it doesn't happen. If you're not measuring the current state already, and by measurement, I'm talking client feedback, looking at write-offs and billings and some of those other metrics that tell you how you're performing. If you're not measuring currently, you don't know what to design, and you don't know what to fix, and you don't know what to implement. And then as you start making changes, you want to make sure that measurement piece is there. So a lot of organizations, they find that measurement is a great place to start because they're not measuring what the current state is. And it can be pretentious to design or redesign a future state if you don't know what you got. A lot of organizations just need to do a crash course on what is CX and engage their leadership on what is CX and how does that tie to our strategic plan. So that's another great place to start, is kind of a leadership discussion about how CX can support and enable business strategy. And start the conversation talking business outcomes. If this is a marketing thing, if this feels like it's fluffy, or if it feels like it's the next management approach of the next few years, it's not going to get the same teeth as if you really start linking how client experience drives measurable business outcomes. So that's a growth in revenue, growth in net profit, attraction and retention of key staff. Those are things that really matter at the executive level. So building that bridge is another really good place to start. So CX becomes an enabler rather than one more thing to do.
It's incremental. Even those two that you mentioned, once you do 2 and then 10, then all 50, a lot of those things definitely add up to one overall client experience.
You're really starting to collect stories, and you two gentlemen are marketers. The power of a good story. And until an organization has a compelling collection of anecdotal stories, look, we did this thing, and it was really a client-centered activity. We're just thinking about the client right here. And look what happened. Look what we did from that. Look at the business outcome from that. That's what starts perking up ears. Wow, that's really exciting. That just saved us an account. Or wow, that just led to a $250,000 opportunity. Now, was that a one-time thing, or should we find a way to institutionalize that so we're generating a string of these opportunities and innovations in the marketplace? It's really hard to find a professional services firm that just really isn't good. It's such a competitive marketplace. If you're in business and at least performing approximately as well as the market from a financial perspective, you're probably a pretty good business already. Unfortunately, that means overall competition is pretty tough, and that's why it's difficult to differentiate. It's hard to look that much better when the only way you survive in professional services is to be pretty good in the first place.
There's a book that I like. It's called Never Lose a Customer Again. The author is Joey Coleman, and it certainly changed my perspective on client experience when I read it. And prior to that, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I always thought that client experience was like 20%. It's an arbitrary number, but like 20% of like what matters. And then after I read that, it went all the way up to 50%, and then now it might even be past that altogether. So the bigger like takeaways from it, all right, it definitely establishes the fact right off the bat that client experience is not like synonymous with before they're a client. Like people tend to get mixed up. Like client experience is like, it's kind of doing sales and pitching and schmoozing for them to become a client. And then this book really emphasizes the fact that actually the most important part of whatever the length of time or the lifetime this client spends with you, that the first 100 days are the most important. Do you agree with that? And does that kind of carry over with the way that you operate?
That's a really solid insight. I have not read that book cover to cover. I'm familiar with it, so it is definitely a great book. Side note, in answer to your question, yes, absolutely. A lot of the clients that we work with, particularly our foundations coming in the architecture, engineering, construction world, those relationships are very project driven. So very often you're pursuing a project before you're really pursuing the client. And what we've seen in that world is, and I'm going to introduce a couple of somewhat technical terms here, but these are good CX terms all of you, all of your listeners should become familiar with. And there's this idea of customer churn, or the inverse is a customer retention. And I'll use the word client here because this is our industry, it's all clients. And we find that first-time clients churn at about a 40% rate. 40% who come to you the first time don't come back for a second. Second-time clients churn at about a 5% rate, a 5 to 7% rate. So what that means is if you can get to the second project or the second engagement with the client, your odds of them being a client for a good long time, if not life, are 4 or 5 times higher. That, I think, reaffirms what you just quoted from the book, that the experience isn't just the buy experience. The experience really is that early relationship. I had all these expectations, and I expected you to be better than the alternatives. If I thought someone else was better, I would have chosen them instead of you. But based on my experience so far, you seem to be the best fit for me and my needs. And you got that first project or that first 100 days to prove me wrong. And if you prove me wrong, I'm going to go to number 2 on the list. If you prove me right, how smart was I to make the wise decision? And I'm going to be with you for the rest of my life, unless, their situation radically changes or there's a fundamental breakdown in how you take care of them going forward. So our research definitely supports what you just said.
Awesome. And Ryan, you're really, I want to reaffirm how much of an expert you are in this specific space. I know you've spoken at over 100 conferences, correct?
That's correct.
So is it all around this specific topic?
Absolutely. When I'm at a leadership or executive conference, I'll talk about how client experience drives business outcomes. When I'm speaking at a marketing or a sales-oriented event like LMA or SMPS, some of those organizations, and we're looking more at the intersection of how client experience drives a growth of the business or supports sales and marketing efforts. There's always an element of CX in what we talk about, and the fact that there's so much to be said. We founded our own community event 5 years ago, CXPS, and it just pulls together a couple hundred practitioners across all professional services to spend 2 days sharing case studies of what they're doing in their firms and how they're leveraging client experience for a variety of topics. We were actually just doing the selections for those yesterday. We have people talking about how pricing and billing impact client experience, how lean project delivery impacts client experience, how to run a great meeting and how that impacts client experience, how to integrate storytelling into your client experience. There's so much depth in the world of client experience. One could probably create a 6-year master's program on client experience and still not cover all the topics.
So speaking of education, what are some good maybe resources like podcasts or books that you'd recommend to learn a little more about CX?
Boy, that's a really tough question at this intersection because I have not yet seen the definitive book written on client experience. There's a lot of great tomes about customer experience, Woo Wow Win, Outside In. Some of those are really solid, but they really talk about it from a customer perspective. So all the examples are banking, retail, hospitality, call centers. I really like the book Effortless Experience, a lot of neat, innovative ideas about reducing friction in service delivery. But again, I think one of the quotes is, if I have to call customer support, it's a failure of design. Those things just don't work as well when you're talking legal or other professional services. We want to draw our clients closer to us. We want to be in communication with them, appropriately and when they want to be in communication with us. So there are some good books, but it takes a very careful and critical eye to suss out from them what's the truth that applies in legal practice versus what are the things I need to rethink or do differently because they don't apply in our world. A lot does apply, but there are some things that don't. That's why we founded our event, just because there really isn't another collection of places to go to get that depth of client experience. I do know that LMA in 2019 had a big thing, and their big thing that year was the Service Metamorphosis Project. A lot of that Service Metamorphosis Project has a good foundation and some strong client experience key ideas. They talk about, do you have a published set of service standards, internally or externally? That's a foundational client experience thing. What does service mean for us? What is our service standard when a client calls for help? What's our response time? Some of those kinds of things. So you'll find a lot of good CX stuff in there. That's at least, some industry specific content. And then of course, Client Savvy has a bunch of white papers, and I think I've got about 90 pages or so of white papers collected. Again, if you'd like to reach out for any of those, feel free to reach out.
I mean, it's a broad thing, but it also can be kind of like tightened up because it has a lot to do with processes, and processes are all about refinement, and then reducing friction, like you mentioned. One thing that I'm curious about is client experience is very personal, and it requires actual people oftentimes being proactive. So as far as internally, do you find that certain roles or certain positions are the ones that are kind of providing that client experience? Is it like the legal assistants are becoming more savvy about it? Is it attorneys that are actually going out of their way? Or even maybe in a larger firm, do they even have dedicated roles that's like, this person is a client experience specialist?
I have probably 2 or 3 things I want to say in response to that question, because that's again a very compact a question to unpack. My experience when I go to Chick-fil-A is predominantly the responsibility of the 2 or 3 $9 an hour employees that I'm going to interact with. So when you look at that as an analogy inside a law practice, the client experience that your firm delivers is predominantly being delivered by the frontline employees, whether it's an attorney, a paralegal, partner, a secretary, who's interacting with the clients. Certainly before the actual service has begun, in the marketing and brand building side, that's generally owned by marketing. When you get into actually doing the business development cycle and the sales and bringing a client on, whatever relationship attorney is bringing that work in primarily owns the relationship and owns accountability for the experience at that phase. And I worked with a firm who mapped out their client experience, and they found 168 distinct steps that a client takes from discovering who they are to long after their engagement's over. And so the very intense exercise we went through. I don't recommend this for everyone, but this was a firm who really wanted to take it all the way. And they identified when the client is at this step in the journey, who's the internal person who's responsible for the client's experience at that point. So they started working on clarifying the roles of the internal stakeholders, the external stakeholders, possibly even some third-party partners or colleagues outside your organization who have an impact or ownership in the client experience. And it was when they created that map, they started finding some gaps. Wow, there's a spot here where the client can very quickly develop a negative perception or have a negative experience. And we don't have a defined person to be accountable for the experience. So who is the best person to be accountable at that point? And then how do we train and equip and provide systems and processes and support to make sure that happens? Part of answering your question, I think, is who owns the client experience on a day-to-day basis. And I think the answer really is everyone. But then you asked in bigger firms, is there someone who kind of owns client experience management? And I think that's a different question. Who owns the experience? Anyone who touches the client directly or indirectly. So that's kind of everybody. Everybody owns the experience. Who owns managing the experience within our firm and managing how our firm delivers an experience with consistency and grace and predictability? That's very much a developing new role. The fastest growing C-level title in American business is Chief Experience Officer. That happens to be my title. We don't have a CEO. We're an experience-led business. The majority of those CXOs seem to be coming out of the marketing and business development world. And that's certainly what we're seeing inside of professional services as well. There's a reason why we're engaged with LMA and SMPS. That's the Society for Marketers of Professional Services, and some of the others. The marketing and business development side of the organization seems to be pushing this more than anybody else. So really neat career opportunity, I think, for a lot of marketing professionals who are looking to elevate their role in the firm into that executive circle. A chief customer officer, a chief client officer, a chief experience officer. It's really a good developing role that acts as the advocate for the client whenever a decision is made internally.
If there's like any one particular last thing you want to leave our listeners with, what would that be?
Well, thank you for the open opportunity. My defined personal goal for where to focus on CX in 2020 goes back to something I said earlier, which is really connecting client experience to business outcomes. And I think that is probably the biggest gap in the curiosity the market is showing and the future we'll eventually all see. I'm going to take a risk here and say that client experience management is really no different than finance. It's no different than technology. It's no different than marketing. A CX isn't something you do and check off the box and say, great, we did something with CX. You can go commission a feedback survey or something and it's a good first step, but doesn't mean you've finished your journey. You wouldn't go out and buy a laptop and give it to an attorney and say, great, we've done technology, check, we're not doing that again. Technology has become an integrated part of the running of a firm. Go talk to your CIO or IT manager and find out, does he or she have to make a business case for where and when and how they invest in technology? They absolutely do. Those of you who own a marketing budget, do you have to make a business case for your marketing budget? You don't just get whatever you ask for. You've got to be able to show a business return. And you don't just stand up a website and logo and colors and say, we've done marketing. Marketing is a capability that you develop that never goes away. It's something you keep on doing. You develop, you implement, and you sustain. So client experience is really no different than marketing or technology. It's a new capability that leading firms are developing and they plan to sustain for the long term. And if you're going to do that, you need to build a solid business case for it. We worked with a large firm, 5,000 person global firm. So this might not sound like a lot of you listeners. We did the same thing with a 45 person firm and I found similar results. But I'll share the story of the 5,000 because it's a fun one. We took 5 years of client sentiment data where they were going out and actually measuring feedback from clients in a very objective and consistent way. And we overlaid that with 5 years of revenue and profit data. And we were able to quantify a positive correlation between sentiment, profitability, and longevity. And when you start doing the math, and it's a topic called client lifetime value. I don't want to get into the details of it, but when you do the math and you actually start to investigate what is the correlation and impact, their happy clients were 92% less likely to stop doing business with them from year to year. They were generating a 3% higher margin. And you start looking at that across their portfolio of business, and you realize, boy, if we take 40% of our unhappy clients and convert them to happy clients, that's going to create $56 million in future lifetime profit. Not revenue, but future lifetime profit. And now you bring research like that up to the executive board, and the executive team looks at, wow, where else are we going to find $56 million in profit? a substantial shift in attention to client experience happened. And they're making some real investments in training and equipping people, setting up standards, new project management delivery methodologies, all to shore up their client experience because they're seeing their sound business case for it. So that's the question I don't see a lot of people asking is, how do I build a business case for this? They're getting hooked because they believe in it, but we've got to transcend religious belief and really start treating CX as a business discipline.
So when are you taking a year off to write this book?
Yeah, great question. I've got it outlined, and I've got about 30,000 to 70,000 words, but I guess you could say, unfortunately, demand has exceeded my capacity to deliver. So we've been a nose down delivering, and it's pulled my attention off of being able to complete that particular piece. But like I said, I've got 92 pages of white papers, which is, a good chunk of it. So anyone who would like any of that content, we're an open book here. We share freely. I believe a rising tide floats all boats, and the more practitioners are out there sharing the word, trying and implementing things, failing, succeeding, sharing stories, the better we're all going to be. Some of the resources we talked about, cxdeck.com, get your free deck of CX cards, clientexperience.org. That's the 2-day event that's happening in May of 2020. We've got some great speakers there. It's not all about client savvy. It's not one of those kind of events. It's just an event for people to come share their stories. Another great resource. And of course, if you do want to talk with us, we're more than happy to. And you'll find us at clientsavvy.com.
Thanks for listening to the Legal Mastermind podcast. If you're interested in working with Ryan and Chase, please email mastermind@marketmymarket.com. Make sure to join the free mastermind group for growing and managing your firm at lawfirmmastermind.com. Ryan Klein and Chase Williams are the managing partners at Market My Market, one of the top legal marketing companies in the United States.